Hey everyone, Brendan Snyder here. How are you? Thank you so much for joining me and welcome to the most underrated albums from the biggest bands. Part 1, there will be a part 2. Keep an eye out for that. It will post tomorrow. And so these bands here have made some of the biggest albums in all of rock, metal, alternative, and they've made it all the way to the top, but even with all of that success, some of their albums are still unfairly overlooked, and it's not always clear why. It's one reason or another here, and we're going to try and talk and hit on some of those different points. But right now, go ahead and join me for 10 of the most underrated albums from the biggest bands. But before we get started, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also leave a comment, hit like, all those things help support my channel. I would greatly appreciate it. And of course, as an added bonus, by subscribing, you'll be able to stay up to date on all that's going on in the world of music, just like this with the most underrated albums from the biggest bands. All right, so as I mentioned, we are going to do 10 of these right now. This is a part 1 video. There will be a part 2. And so for this one here, we are going to focus on A through L of the alphabet. Kicking things off here, we are going to start with none other than Aerosmith, Rockin' a Hard Place from 1982, 7th studio album. This one here is the only one to not feature Joe Perry and Brad Whitford, 2 founding members of the band. Now, taking their place was Jimmy Crespo and Rick Dufay. And what I really liked about this was that Steven Tyler, lead vocalist of the group, partnered with Jimmy Crespo to co-write a lot of the songs that are on this, giving it a real unique flavor. Instead of this just turning into a Steven Tyler solo album, it's a band effort. So the same way that he would always partner up with Joe Perry to co-write, he was doing that here with Jimmy Crespo on it. And again, why this album wasn't more successful, probably just the fact that it was missing 2 key members. But that doesn't mean that it's a bad album. There's some really good tracks. Case in point with one of my favorites, Lightning Strikes. And when I say one of my favorites, I mean one of my favorites of all the catalog within Aerosmith. I think this song is just really good. So check that out if you're not familiar. Maybe give this album another listen and see what you think now. Now this next one just completely baffles me. Deep Purple, The Battle Rages On from 1993, 14th studio album. It was a reunion album of the Mark II, the most famous lineup of the band, featuring, of course, Ritchie Blackmore, and the last one to feature Ritchie Blackmore, so far at least. And this album is just so good from top to bottom. It's a mystery as to why this thing was received so poorly, other than it was 1993. Grunge was raging, alternative rock, and this stuff here was just not considered part of that. By about 1994, a lot of the classic rock bands started to make a return. And I think this was just a little too early on the radar for that, unfortunately. Otherwise, perhaps they would have been able to ride out that classic rock return in the mid to late 90s. Favorite tracks on here, there's so many of them. Title track that I love, but Anya, Time to Kill, and Solitaire, all of those have such great melodic rock and melody within those things that they're just absolutely beautiful songs. Next one up, Def Leppard's self-titled album from 2015, 12th studio album. For me at least, this was finally a true return to form album in the vein of Hysteria and Adrenalize. The band was trying some new things on this. They were trying to stay fresh, but they also embraced who they were on this album. Songs like Dangerous had such a classic feel to it on this one here. Man Enough, they were trying something new, but still had a bit of that flavor from songs like Pour Some Sugar on Me and Let's Get Rocked and stuff like that. And then they tried something completely new, We Belong, which is a beautiful ballad, but at the same time, all 5 band members take lead vocals, something that had never happened. So whether you were looking for new stuff, classic stuff, middle of the line, for me this album has it all, but for some reason lots of fans just didn't want to give it a chance. They just kind of blew it off. And I think it's one of their most classic sounding albums. So if you're one of those fans that didn't give it its proper due back in 2015, I'm highly recommending it here. Next one up, Fleetwood Mac, Time from 1995, their 16th studio album. So this one here does not feature Lindsey Buckingham or Stevie Nicks, two of the most famous members within all of Fleetwood Mac, and Fleetwood Mac sure has had a lot of different members over the years. Still in the ranks is Christine McVie, and I've got to say she does a beautiful job holding this whole thing together, and I think she is one of the unsung heroes within the group who really deserved more of the attention. Unfortunately, it always went to Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks. So a lot of times I find when those two other key members are out, she really gets to shine. This album, case in point. But taking over for Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks, we've got Dave Mason on guitar from Traffic, who does an outstanding job bringing an entirely new flavor of, to the guitar parts that are on here. And then Becca Bramlett, who's a very soulful singer, different than Stevie Nicks, but again, bringing a nice new flavor. So while this album has plenty of key classic sounding moments that are Fleetwood Mac, it also broke some new ground, which I really like on this. And having recently become a bigger Dave Mason fan, this album here now just moved up the ranks for me at least. And my favorite track on here, Blow by Blow, which is a Dave Mason co-written and sung track that's on here. All right, next one up, Genesis, Calling All Stations, 1997, 15th studio album, and unfortunately last one to date. Don't think we're going to be getting another one. It did feature new vocalist Ray Wilson taking over for Phil Collins on here. And the critics unfortunately chastised this thing, saying it lacked direction, but I have to disagree. For me, this album was a return to form in terms of a more prog rock direction, less of that pop sound, and I think it's where the band finally figured out who they were balancing between those two worlds, the prog and the pop and so forth, and they did a beautiful job on this one. My favorite track, if you're not familiar with this one, you want one of those songs to go to and check out, I think you'll be surprised, check out the song Shipwreck. It's an absolutely amazing track. All right, next one up here, one of the most underrated of all albums, period, Guns N' Roses' Chinese Democracy from 2008, sixth studio album. Took 17 long years for this album to be made. I'm sure there's a lot of stops and starts and sputters and things along the way. I know they weren't working on it for a straight 17 years, but on and off at least. And definitely one of the most expensive albums ever made. I think something, in the multi-million-dollar range kind of a thing. And so this one here, none other than Axl Rose, the only original member left, but we do have Dizzy Reed, who was present in 1991. So you do have those two guys, but everyone else on here is new. And, it was criticized for the overproduction, too many layered parts and all that kind of stuff. And I do totally understand that. I think this album would have really shined with some editing and a remix on it. I still hope to get that one day. But if you can put aside the fact that this is not Appetite for Destruction, it's not going to be Use Your Illusion, and then what album of theirs has sounded like any other album? Every single one of theirs has been different. And so for this here to be what it is and stand on its own and just listen to it for the stellar, in-depth tracks that it is, I think that's what needs to be done in order to enjoy this. You got to release that idea that this is not going to be an Appetite album. Favorite song on here, Madagascar. It's a killer epic in the vein of the songs like November Rain and Estrange and stuff like that. And so there are those key moments on this album that I think warranted being up there along the upper echelons of the albums, like the Use Your Illusion albums and stuff like that. Okay, next one, INXS Switch from 2005. This was their 11th studio album, last album of all original material. They did do one album after this, Original Sin, but it was re-recordings of older songs and it had different vocalists and things. So last one of original material here, and it featured a new vocalist, J.D. Fortune, who took over for Michael Hutchence. Unfortunately passed away in 1997, but I think a lot of people passed this album up here because it was, or they were finding their lead vocalist through a reality TV game show where contestants competed to become the new lead singer. And a lot of these things, that I've read up on this is they pre-selected J.D. Fortune put him in the mix. They knew they were going to select him in the end of the day of this sort of thing. And so it made it, unfortunately, a little unfair to the rest of the people that were competing and so forth. Whether or not that's true, don't really know, but that is at least what I've heard along the way as far as this is concerned. The album, though, I think is outstanding. It's amazing. It is one of the best albums. If you can leave aside that Michael Hutchence isn't the lead vocalist on here, it is a solid, well-written, well-recorded, beautiful sounding album on here. Some of my favorites: Devil's Party, Pretty Vegas, Hot Girls. My favorite track of the whole thing is the last song on here, God's Top 10. It's one of the most beautiful tribute songs to Michael Hutchence. If you only check out one, definitely check out that song on here. Okay, next up, Judas Priest, Demolition from 2001, 14th studio album. Second one to feature Tim Ripper Owens, who I happen to really like that era of the band. A lot of people would not even consider this and say, you know, the two albums that he was part of are the worst of Judas Priest. But, you know, unfortunately that happens a lot. You change members and those are the albums that people won't even consider. They just hear that somebody's not part of it and they won't consider it. And I definitely think that's the thing people have to get past on a lot of these albums. But this one here, to me, was even better than Jugulator. That one was a little contrived and derivative of Painkiller, in my opinion, trying to make a clone of that album. This one here, the band stood on their own 2 feet, made an album that was unique, and you know, it's definitely worth checking out on here. There's some amazing tracks on this thing. One on One, Hell is Home, Feed on Me, and Metal Messiah, the last track, where here was a metal band actually doing what was popular at the time, merging rap and rock. But the way that they did it, having Tim Owens sing in multiple different ranges of vocals and then putting that all together as though you're hearing like 3 people like the Beastie Boys rap. And don't let the word rap throw you off. It's just how the stuff was put together. But it was so well done that if more bands had done this, I think that they could have made that merge into that more modern sound. But again, unfortunately, people heard Judas Priest and they discredited that and they didn't give this its due. And like case in point with a lot of bands, I think oftentimes the singles release are not the best tracks on the albums. There were so many other good ones like the ones I just mentioned. Okay, down to the last 2 for at least this episode. Remember, there will be a second one. Kiss, Dynasty, 7th studio album from the band. I know I talk a lot about this one here. It's an underrated album. It's one of the hated albums that I love. Lots and lots of stuff like that. This one here just so good. But I think generally, unfortunately, Kiss fans, regular fans, people couldn't get into this here because they jumped on the disco bandwagon. And a lot of people think that only the opening track that's on here, I Was Made for Loving You, is disco, but you really do have to listen to the rest of the album on here. There's a lot of disco tinge to the songs and other stuff on here, and that turned a lot of people off. But for me at least, I think Kiss is one of the best bands to have ever merged their rock sound with what was going on in that era, the disco, together. And it did, I think it did really well in that regard, at least. Now remember, they actually had a number 11 Billboard Hot 100 hit with the song I Was Made for Loving You. So it wasn't like this album, you know, did poorly or anything. It's just remembered in a poor light, unfortunately, but it did very well actually at the time, and it's just been overlooked ever since then, kind of a thing. My favorite track is actually a Peter Criss sung track on here called Dirty Livin'. All right, and the last one we're going to talk about here, Live, The Turn from 2014, their 9th studio album and newest album to date. They have made an EP that they put out, but they have not made a full-length album since this one here. And this was the first to feature their new vocalist at the time, Chris Shen, who previously sang for a group called Unified Theory, which was an interesting group made up of Blind Melon and Pearl Jam members. So quite the pedigree there. So you take that vocalist out, which I always thought did an amazing job, but when he came in here, I was so stoked to get something else from Chris Shen. And the music here was credited to all 4 members of this group here writing on this. So again, not just a group of former Live guys bringing in, you know, a new vocalist kind of thing and writing for him, that sort of stuff. But it was really done as a band effort. And First single that came off of this album, The Way Around Is Through, which was a pretty good song, but I didn't feel that really represented the album very well. The two opening tracks made a really great 1-2 punch on here. Siren's Call and Don't Run to Wait, I thought were really good. So just another one of those things. Maybe they chose the wrong lead single to get fans into it, but this was a popular era where bands were reforming, bringing in other singers to front and stuff like that. And sometimes it worked for groups, other times it didn't. And unfortunately, I think just a lot of people felt without, their most famous vocalist in here. I always have trouble pronouncing his name, Kowalczyk, if I'm saying that right, Ed Kowalczyk. But, and he was the main writer of the group and so forth, but I really liked what the group was able to do. And I think Christian definitely was able to stand up and take charge and give the band a good run. But there you go. So that is 10 of the most underrated albums from the biggest bands. That was part 1. As I said, there is going to be a part 2, so you're going to want to keep an eye out for that, which we'll post tomorrow. And at that time, I'm going to run through M through Z. So lots of good stuff to look forward there. Certainly consider sharing this video out on social media. Help spread the word for my channel. I would greatly appreciate it. Otherwise, take care, have a good one, and don't forget to check back